That's me, huh? Good afternoon. My name is Terry Gill, and I'm the Secretary of Economic Development for the state of Kentucky. Grateful to be here to share a little bit about what's happening in our state and give you some perspective from somebody who's never been in state government before. I have been working for Governor Bevan now for 2 years. He's never had any state government experience, and so he thought it best to surround himself with a bunch of people who also didn't have any state government experience, which explains a cabinet full of people from the private sector who have stepped into what I call the alternate reality of state government with the perspective of a business person. We were all, most of us in the cabinet were business executives. Prior to joining the cabinet, I was the CEO of a company. I was working for a private equity group helping turn around one of the portfolio companies in Cincinnati. Prior to that, I'd been CEO of several other companies. So I come to this experience, economic development, purely from a business person's perspective. And so part of what I'm going to share with you today is how the state of Kentucky views workforce and within the context, really, of economic development. And they are clearly inseparable. Everybody in this room understands that it has really become an arms race for talent. Every state has shifted their focus, at least the ones that are doing well, from one that is maybe based on policy initiatives or incentive platforms to how do we prepare our students, how do we prepare that organic supply for the jobs that are here today and the jobs that we know are coming our way. And so it's a huge part of what we do. So I'll provide some context for you in terms of who Kentucky is, maybe some word association games, and a little bit about the challenges that are unique to our state, but probably aren't unique in the point that other states have some of these same challenges. And we'll talk about what we're doing and whether it's working or not. So I thought we would pick a famous quote from a famous politician: all politics is local, and in Kentucky, like many of your states, all workforce issues are local. There is no one prescriptive, one-size-fits-all for the workforce issues you face. It really becomes hyper local in some ways, very parochial in terms of how you view this issue. So a little thing about Kentucky, we are on the western edge of the Eastern time zone. We're really centrally located right in the heart of America. We're within a day's drive of 60% of the population. Most people don't know that. We are a state that is heavily invested in manufacturing, and I'll give you some examples of that. But before I do, when you think Kentucky, what's the first thing that pops into your mind? Bourbon, which is an upgrade from chicken. Now, I like chicken, but I really like bourbon. What most people don't realize is the state is a really incredible manufacturing powerhouse. And you think about some of these stats, they're remarkable for any state, but really remarkable when you think we only have 4.4 million people. Number one in U.S. vehicle production per capita. Number two in exports for aerospace products, only behind Washington State. That's probably one thing you didn't think about in terms of Kentucky. So advanced manufacturing is a big part of our economy. Number two in air freight volume, and that is before. So we have UPS's World Port Hub in Louisville, Kentucky. DHS has their North American World Port in Covington, which is actually Cincinnati's airport, which is actually northern Kentucky. And Amazon last year made a $1.4 billion investment in building out their Prime Air North American cargo facility in northern Kentucky. Getting back to that previous slide about our central location. So we are in this perfect spot for distribution and logistics. So if you need to make something and get it to any market in the world, geographically speaking, Kentucky is very well positioned. So number three in total vehicle production overall. Number nine in upstream metal fabrication. About 40% of the stainless steel in North America is produced in our state. 2 of the 3 remaining aluminum smelters operating in North America are in our state. Again, logistics and very low production costs, very low electrical costs. So number 6 in top manufacturing states by GDP. The reason this is important for context is that we have a real talent problem because we have a demographic problem, because many of the people who are filling many of these positions are tailing out of their career. So we have to sort of fast forward all of our strategies to address the near-term solutions. So a little bit about the progress we've made. Many of you are benefiting from this sort of the macroeconomic factors that are clearly influencing this country's economy. So since Governor Bevin has been in office, we've attracted $17.2 billion of private capital. That's not infrastructure, that's not roadways or highways or bridges. This is private capital coming into the state of Kentucky from both foreign and domestic sources. We've created over 47,000 new jobs. What's interesting about that stat is that's more investment, more job creation in 3 years. He's been in office actually 3 years this month than any other previous administration in the history of the Commonwealth has achieved over 4 years. Last year, we attracted $9.2 billion worth of capital into the state. The best year prior to that was $5.1 billion. So on the one hand, if you're in economic development, you look like a hero, right? The other side of that is it puts more pressure on a problem we already had, right? We already had a question about how do we fulfill existing businesses' need for workforce. And then you put that sort of momentum behind it, again, it just puts more pressure on our solution set. There's an old proverb, maybe you've heard it before, it says, without vision, the people will perish. And that is true of anything. It's true of businesses, it's true of communities, of states, and the vision that Governor Bevin has for the state is very simple. And a little World Association game here. If you were challenged with engineering and manufacturing a product to the highest technical degree possible, and you had to pick one country in continental Europe to start, what country would you pick? It's amazing. I've asked that question 500 times in 2 years. And every time, people just instinctively say Germany, unless you ask it in Switzerland, which is a true story. But you know, why is that? Does it mean that you can't manufacture that in Italy or Australia or Austria or any country, developed country in Europe? Of course you could, right? You could make the argument for many of them. But they own that concept. They own that brand. Now, if I asked you the same question, you had to engineer and manufacture that product to the highest technical degree possible, and you had to do it in North America, what state would you choose? If we keep going, you'll get more, right? You'll get Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, South Carolina, California, Texas, Massachusetts. I mean, you could make the argument for virtually any state, which tells you two things, really. Nobody owns it like Germany owns it. And if nobody owns it, it must be available for ownership. And Kentucky's going to own it. That's the vision. Very simple, right? But the reason why it's important is that everything we do from a workforce standpoint needs to sort of fall in line with that vision. And so hopefully part of what you'll learn today in terms of how the state views that, and when we say engineering, it's not purely engineering of a physical product. It could be biomedical engineering. It could be all sorts of thought-based enterprises. But that clearly forms both economic policy and also forms how we view the workforce situation. So here are some challenges we've got. We've got a diverse population, and I'll show you a graphic here that demonstrates that. So it's not just one economy in a state that's relatively small. It's actually several. We have historically been burdened with a very low workforce participation rate, and in the face of a booming economy, that becomes a big problem. And this last one I found very interesting, which was the workforce dollars. Usually from a private sector perspective, most problems I've encountered in my business life have been a function of capital. There isn't enough of it. It's coming in the wrong sequence. It's priced inappropriately. It's inconsistent. In this case, the workforce issue was not fundamentally a capital problem, and I'll show you what I mean by that. First of all, a little bit about the state. We have 120 counties. I wouldn't recommend that. I mean, you think about rolling out any initiative statewide is hard to do. You got 120 people who all want to know why they don't get more, right? If you look at it from a density standpoint, if you took the state of Texas and you had the same density of counties that we have in Kentucky and Texas, there'd be almost 1,000 counties in Texas, okay? So we've got a lot of counties. That's one challenge. That's hard to overcome, by the way. So if you look at the state, we call this kind of the Golden Triangle. This is northern Kentucky. So that's Cincinnati. It's literally right across the river. This is Jefferson County, Louisville. Southern Indiana is just across the river. This is Lexington. So you can see, obviously, in the more densely populated areas, a lot of existing industry, probably a bit more educated workforce, not nearly as rural. We have very low unemployment rates. And then this is 3.7%. That's the Bowling Green area. So that's just north of Nashville, probably about an hour north of Nashville, which is a booming part of the Southeast right now. So our challenge is, obviously, what's the challenge is in those four parts of the state, which, by the way, represent about 50% of the GDP. So if we don't solve it for that, it's probably not going to get solved down here, right? So we got to figure out what do we do in those parts of the state that are resident and relevant to that part of the state, which means you can't have a one-size-fits-all. So no one wants to be 47 in this category, but unfortunately we are. And we'll talk a little bit about the challenges related to how do you get more people into the workforce, because that is a near-term issue and reality that we have to face. So when I first came to Frankfort, which is the capital, how many people knew that Frankfort's the capital of Kentucky? A couple. I'd been there one other time when I was like 4th grade for the field trip. That was it. So I didn't know really anything about Frankfort, other than as a private sector guy who ran a business in Kentucky. I didn't want really the government to do really anything for me. Kind of leave me alone, is what I really wanted. So when I got there, I started asking a bunch of questions because it seemed clear to me within weeks of being there that this economic thing was really a workforce thing. And so I said, okay, well, let me understand, who's responsible for workforce in the state? And how much money do they have to work with? So I got my staff to sort of map all this out, and I said, well, we've got the Education and Workforce Development Cabinet, they get $160 million. Health and Family Services, they get $260 million, so on and so forth. $1.2 billion comes into the state every year. The GDP for the whole state's only $200 billion. So this seemed like not a capital problem. I said, okay, well then how do you know who's spending what and whether or not any of that spend is actually working? So I said, so who's the recipient of those dollars, the beneficiary of those dollars? That's what they gave me. 53 area technology centers. We have the KCTCS, which is the Kentucky Community and Technical Colleges. We got career centers. We got innovation boards. We got post-secondary career programs. We got ad districts and school districts. Everybody was in the workforce business. But no one could really tell me whether or not any of these entities, as well-intentioned as they are, and they all are well-intentioned, whether or not it was working. Can we measure it? Can we understand if it's working well? How do we double down on that initiative? And how do we reduce the duplication and the redundancy that you just know is inherent in a problem like this, right? So that was the first thing we tried to understand is how do we bring some process to this problem? Because without the ability to understand where the dollars are going and whether it's working or not, how do we know whether or not we're spending money on the right thing? And that sort of formed a large part of, I think, of our strategy. So if you think about the four things that we're really sort of recognizing, one is that we've got to realign the education system to meet the needs of business. There was a disconnect in our state between the presidents of the state universities and the business community. Now, not to say they didn't have some communication. Obviously, there are lots of people on boards of trustees who have business connections, but in terms of really understanding what is the mission of these universities and how well connected are they at the state level, the state universities, but also the area technical and community colleges, how well are they creating content and curriculum that's relevant to the industry and the opportunity in that part of the world? We had to get businesses to engage to define their current needs. How many of you are in the private sector, running or working in some sort of private sector capacity? How many of you have a workforce issue? Everybody has a workforce issue. I mean, when people come up to me and say, I have a workforce issue, I said, of course you do, because everyone has one, right? But until you tell me specifically what your problem is, and don't ask me to solve it on a transactional basis. If we're going to solve your problem, let's solve it for a longer period of time, right? Which means we have to lean into the business community to get them to understand that without their direct engagement, it's unlikely we're going to come up with a solution that's satisfactory to them over the long term. We have to empower communities to design their own solutions. Remember the 120 counties? There is sometimes a case where counties are waiting for it to happen. And we are really out there saying to these communities, we don't know your community like you do. You're going to have to help us understand, if we're going to invest in the community, what's important to you. And we'll talk about one of the initiatives that we've kicked off in 2016 that's been hugely effective, and really trying to get the local communities to buy in. And then lastly, it's increase the workforce pipeline to accommodate growth. And we'll talk about that labor force participation rate, because that's a big part of that issue. Okay, so this is all in the context of emerging workforce, existing workforce, and those on the sidelines. All right, let's jump in here. So outcomes-based funding for universities. First time this has ever happened, which means that now all the state universities receive funding based on their ability to solve the problem, which means that we are now beginning to measure student outcomes. So the funding model isn't what did we give you last year, it's how effective are you with state dollars in addressing the business needs in the state of Kentucky. And so that's been a big shift, not particularly popular when we first rolled it out, but I think they're starting to understand the linkage between the graduation rates and student outcomes, because as we all know, or many of you probably know, the single largest category of debt held on the consumer basis, unsecured debt, is $1.4 trillion. More than credit card debt, more than auto loans. It's staggering, right? So we've got to figure out a way to address this. Work-ready skills scholarships. We've got five sectors we've identified where if you're in the workforce, want to be retrained, receive a 2-year associate's degree in IT, in healthcare, in construction, in advanced manufacturing, and logistics. One of those 5 will pay for it. Okay, we will pay for your education. And then dual credit scholarships, where we're saying to high school students, why not take college courses while you're in high school, right? Begin to reduce the amount of hours you need to achieve to get your undergraduate degree. So we're really trying to wade into the educational system at the secondary and post-secondary levels to try to draw that linkage between what they're doing and what the businesses are looking for. The Talent Pipeline Management, TPM, how many of you heard of that concept? Really, really excited about this. Okay, this is a sort of a partnership between the Kentucky Chamber, the U.S. Chamber, and the private sector for us to begin to use a concept that anybody in manufacturing has used from day one, which is how do we measure our organic inputs, right? How do we measure and manage our own supply chain? And it's really taking that concept and rolling out to labor, which is really conceptually makes a lot of sense. So these are the steps. I won't go through all of them in any detail, but it's really a methodology that allows us to begin to measure how effective these sources of labor are. And I can tell you that from back to the $1.2 billion issue we had, this gives us a framework, a way to measure the output. And we began to say, okay, that source is doing particularly well. How do we scale that particular idea up and roll it out across the state? So we have just started this rollout. It's in about 3 communities. Actually, we have 3 different collaboratives in the state, but it's rolling out throughout the state. Beth Davidson is here from the Kentucky Chamber, who's leading this initiative at the state level. I would encourage you, if you're interested to learn more about this, find Beth. She's an absolute gem to have on staff in terms of the Chamber's perspective, but we really like this approach, and we'll be tracking this very, very closely. Kentucky fame, started by Toyota. The largest Toyota manufacturing plant in the world is in Georgetown, Kentucky. Every Camry made in the U.S. comes out of that facility. They're a huge partner of the state. They recognized the AMT skill set was one they couldn't find, so they created what is really kind of a hybrid on an apprenticeship program where they now have a methodology for young people, should I say, to gain their AMT degree credentials while they're at work. So it's a framework that Kentucky has championed since 2006, and it's been really, really helpful. 89% graduation rate for a position that's sometimes hard to fill. Apprenticeships, probably like many states, it's a big part of what we're doing at the statewide level. We've got 3,400 registered programs right now. 250 programs and 3,400 participants. This is the one I think is most interesting. The Work Ready Skills Initiative. What we said was we're going to spend $100 million and we're going to provide that as a grant. And we're going to say to all 120 counties, if you have an idea and want to submit a grant for a a training center, for instance, or some other asset that you think would help your community address its workforce needs, write the grant. But it has to be a three-way deal. I want businesses involved, I want the school system involved, and I want the community involved. We received over 900 submissions, almost $1 billion requested for $100 million. And we also said we are matching those dollars. So we will match you dollar for dollar. So we ended up granting the $100 million, but it turned into $120 million in local matches, so almost $250 million for a $100 million investment. Really a successful story here. Two quick examples. In Caldwell County, a technology center, and Jessamine County, another effort to improve the equipment in the school systems. I'm going to wrap up here pretty quickly. I'm going to be over, unfortunately. But SK Launch, this is an initiative to begin to talk to students at the elementary school level about career paths and choices, and really getting into the school system, because we've got 120 districts. We don't have career counselors in all those schools, so we have to have the businesses have to step in and begin to explain what the chances or what the choices are for students based on the industries that are close to their schools. Lastly, increasing the pipeline, transitioning military, a big one. Medicaid recipients. Kentucky was one of the first to adopt the Medicaid waiver, which was saying if you're able-bodied, no dependents, and there's no reason for you not to be working, you got to start working. In order to receive your Medicaid benefits, you're going to have to solve for this issue, which is you need 20 hours a week in either volunteering, getting your education, or being retrained and reskilled. And so that's trying to bring about 120,000 people off the sidelines into our workforce. We've got 25,000 people currently in our prison population. Guess what? 85% of them are going to get out. And if we don't train them or give them an opportunity to find a different way to make a living, they're probably going to go back to whatever's got them there in the first place, right? So we've got to address that population. And then we've got young people aging out of foster care, another population that needs to be cared for. Wrapping up here, just let me show you kind of what's happened. Now let's look at these last two. Unemployment rate is about 4.5%, but most encouraging, we're now almost 60% in the labor force participation rate. So we went from 47th to 43rd. Not great progress, but directionally trending the right way. So I covered a lot of material in a short period of time. We are encouraged by our relationship with the U.S. Chamber and the TPM. We think that's a big part of our success story. If you have questions for me, you can reach me at terry.gill@ky.gov, and I'll be here for a few minutes after the presentation. Thank you all for your time.